Spoilers can be a difficult thing to avoid when you're trying to review any piece of media that has a significant amount of story. The majority of the time, you can at least present the general premise and setup of the story without worrying too much about spoiling anything. Every once in a while, though, you'll run into a story where it is virtually impossible to talk about the story without almost instantly giving away some kind of spoiler. That is the situation with the game I'll be talking about in this video. 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim. So let's see if we can get through this review without giving too much away, but also presenting my thoughts on the game. Also note that I'll only be pulling video from very early sections of the game, so if you see some replayed footage during the review, that'll be why. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is a mix of a visual novel / adventure game and a tower defense / strategy RPG developed by Vanillaware. It was released for PS4 in 2019 with a Switch version released in 2022. I am playing the PS4 version for this review. 13 Sentinels is $59.99 on both the PlayStation and Nintendo digital stores. The game is rated T, which I think is actually a very fitting rating for this game. As I said when I opened this review, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim's story is really hard to talk about without diving into spoiler territory. However, let's open this discussion up by saying that I found the story super interesting and engaging the whole time. The plot does get a little convoluted, but I think that the payout is very much worth the confusion and the difficulty trying to understand what the narrative is doing. What is the story about? In order to kind of give a non-spoiler version, let's take a look at what the store pages present to us as the premise of the game. Vanillaware, the storytellers behind Odin's Sphere and Dragon's Crown, craft a sci-fi mystery epic spanning 13 intertwining stories, uncover the truth, and delve into a 2D side-scrolling adventure featuring gorgeous art and environments. Then battle the kaiju in fast-paced top-down combat, customize the Sentinels with an arsenal of mech suit weaponry, and fight to defend humanity. So, what can we pull from this? First, the story of 13 Sentinels is a sci-fi mystery, which is a really good description of what you'll experience in the game. You will be running into many sci-fi ideas throughout the course of the narrative, and oftentimes you'll be left wondering how in the world these concepts all connect together in a way that actually makes sense at the end of the day. Second, the story of the game takes place by playing through the experience of 13 different characters over the course of the game. Many of these characters will have intertwining stories, but seeing things from the different perspectives will often give us more information behind what was going on than we did whenever we saw them maybe from the first person we saw that event taking place with. The last thing that we can glean from this short official description is that you'll be battling kaiju in Sentinels, which are like giant mechs. This presents at least one of the sci-fi elements you'll be seeing in the game. That's all I'll really talk about the story. Again, I found the story to be super interesting in this game. It always kept me guessing about what was coming next and wondering how this latest reveal connected to the other parts I knew about. It was a story experience that I can't say I had ever really experienced in a video game before, and I mean that in the best way possible. Like, seriously, the story is so good in this game, and even though I can't really talk a lot about it because I don't want to accidentally give away any spoilers, it was very much a ride that I enjoyed and that I would recommend for people who are really into stories and sci-fi in particular, because it was just a really enjoyable time. The gameplay of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim can be split into two rather different styles of gameplay. The first is the more visual novel / adventure game style of gameplay that the game calls Remembrance, and the second is a combination of tower defense and strategy RPG that the game calls Destruction. The menu of the game allows you to pick which of these you're wanting to play, but you will find that there are times you have to play the other category to progress further in the story. You can't just play all of one mode and then all of the other. You'll be moving between the two as you progress. Admittedly, this is a strange combination of genres, and while I'm not sure that both sides of the game will be of equal interest to everyone, I did think that this strange combination worked out in the end. So let's take a closer look at these two different styles of gameplay. I'll start by looking at what the game calls Remembrance first. When you select this mode, you will have to pick a character that you want to progress the story for. At first, you only get a few options, but as you play more of the story, there will be more characters unlocked so that you can play as them and then learn about their perspectives and events within the story. There are 13 of these characters, so there will be a decent amount of story to go through in the game, but not every character has the same amount of story to experience, so some are definitely shorter, while others have more lengthy narratives. Each character will have a variety of story branches that you can find by playing that character more. Sometimes progressing down a certain branch will give you a topic that will allow you to go down a different path in that situation. There is also a visual aid of a chart that will help you see which paths you've taken and have left to take, and the keywords you'll need to unlock certain paths. This can be really helpful for trying to figure out what you're missing, and was definitely a welcome addition to the game, because otherwise sometimes trying to figure out what you needed and where you needed to be when to do this can be kind of difficult unless you are really using a guide. So having this little aid really kind of helped you figure out where you needed to be and maybe what you needed to know before you could progress more. When you load into the story section, you'll be controlling your chosen character through 2D environments interacting with other people and objects in the world. Compared to many other adventure-style games, there aren't too many complicated moments. You don't have an inventory to manage or have to figure out combinations of items to use to progress. It's a pretty straightforward style of gameplay. There are a few times where you can meet your end by doing something wrong or not being quick enough to figure out what you need to do, but these moments are very rare. And sometimes it's kind of a bad thing that they're so rare because you aren't always expecting when they're happening. So like all of a sudden you have one of those experiences and it's like, wait, what? Like, and you maybe don't make the right decision in those cases and wind up having kind of a game over and have to restart that section. Honestly, I found the remembrance part of the game very enjoyable. It's definitely my favorite part of the game because it was the most story heavy part of the game. I enjoyed most of the characters and figuring out what to do and trying to piece together the mystery of what's going on. It just kept me hooked. If I did have to give one drawback from this mode, it is that some of the characters you play wind up replaying kind of the similar scenario multiple times, and it can feel a little bit repetitive, especially on the front end. Like eventually you will run into like a divergence from that path. You'll find somebody new or something else will happen and you'll go different, but you usually have the same startup, which can get a little bit repetitive. It didn't really bother me that much, but it was something that I did kind of notice, especially with some of the characters. Destruction, on the other hand, is a bit more involved, but also the more underwhelming of the two aspects of gameplay for me. In this mode, you're trying to protect a glowing blue terminal from incoming kaiju called Deimos. You do this by controlling up to 6 mechs called Sentinels. There are 4 different types of Sentinels that have a different set of abilities. First gen Sentinels focus on melee combat. Second gen doesn't really have a solid focus and is a little bit more multi-purpose. Third gen is focused on long range attacks and taking out large groups of people. And fourth gen can fly and tend to be more support based in nature. During this combat, you can select various attacks to take out the kaiju. Then after each attack, your character has to wait a certain amount of time before it can take another action. Each map can have a different type of goal, but most of the time it is about taking out all of the kaiju in a given area. There are also bonus objectives that will unlock various mystery file entries in the in-game reference section called Analysis. This is where you would go to see parts of the story, see certain items that the story wants to make sure that you understand what are, and things like that. Some of these bonus objectives will be only used for Sentinels instead of the 6, to have specific characters in battle, or to not allow a certain amount of damage to the city or terminal. There is also a bonus award for getting an S rating on the map. As you progress in the game, you'll be able to improve your Sentinels and their pilots in a number of different ways. Your pilots will gain levels after battles and unlock various abilities at certain milestones. You can also spend meta chips that you gain from both Remembrance and Destruction to level up and unlock moves for your Sentinels or the system in general, and later on you'll be able to upgrade various stats using those as well. Admittedly, I only really ever use my chips on attack and system upgrades, but the stat upgrades are there as well if you want and need to use them. Now, admittedly, it took me a little bit to get warmed up to Destruction, but eventually I did find it enjoyable and got into the groove of it. Was it ever as enjoyable as the Remembrance part of the game for me? Not really. Does it detract from the other half of the game? I imagine that will probably depend on how much you like or dislike the mode. For me, it didn't detract from the Remembrance part of the game. It did feel a little bit repetitive at times because you do have to do I think there's 35, 36 different levels of the Destruction mode. So it got a little repetitive, but it wasn't really bad for me either. This division in the gameplay makes the game really hard to know how people will react. These two halves are so very different and not gameplay types that are typically linked together. Personally, I found the Remembrance mode to be very enjoyable and engaging and was the high point of the experience for me. Destruction mode was decent, but it took a little bit more to get used to and could be a little repetitive after time. For me, Destruction didn't really detract from the enjoyment of the game overall, but I also know that my experience may not be everyone's here. Much like the other parts of the game, the art style is also divided down that line of separation that splits the game in two. The Remembrance part of the game has an absolutely gorgeous art style. Environments and characters are detailed and great to look at. The use of lighting in the game is also something you just can't help but notice as you're playing through the various scenes and see the beautiful sunrises or sunsets or the light coming through windows. There's just so much detail, and the light aspect of it just makes it all the more memorable. So yeah, the Remembrance part of the game is just beautiful. beautiful, and you can't help but appreciate the art style that Vanillaware is employing here. Destruction mode, on the other hand, is much more disappointing. You get an overhead view of the part of the city you're battling in, but the indicators for you and the enemies are a bit underwhelming and mostly consist of glowing, digitized looking shapes. There are some impressive elements of art in this mode. Those are mostly in the dialogue sections between the characters, and this can be a little awkward since when in the mechs, the characters are not wearing any clothes, which means you get a lot of strategically placed machinery in front of many of the characters. Ultimately, this difference in art style, I feel, is reflective of the difference in purpose behind the two halves of the game. It's a lot harder to have well-detailed swarms of enemies than it is to create picturesque scenes in the main story mode. While I understand that, I also couldn't help being a little disappointed in how different the two art styles were. On the sound front, you don't really have this divide. The strength of both sides of the game is definitely the voice acting. While the destruction mode does have people say some of the same voice lines repeatedly during battle, the other voice acting was all very well done. This was by far the strongest element of the sound design for both sides and for the game as a whole. Saying that, it's not that the music of the game is bad, but often I find that in general, when games have a lot of voice acting, the music just can't stand out as much. There are probably some exceptions to that rule, but in general, it seems like the focus is wanted to be on what people are saying and not the music. And that kind of replaces the need for very catchy, thematic music. All that to say, the music is still fitting, but just doesn't take center stage like the voice acting or even some of the sound effects that you'll experience in the game do, which is kind of disappointing because I always like me some very catchy theme music, but I also understand and really enjoyed the voice acting and sound effects of the game. 13 Sentinels is such a hard game to give a final rating to. On the one hand, it presented a story that had me hooked and kept me guessing throughout the game. It was an experience unlike any game I had played before in terms of how the game kept adding new pieces that would throw you off and yet all be connected by the end of the game. The game, or at least around half of it, is also just beautiful with wonderful artwork and amazing use of lighting effects. It also has great voice acting to top it all off. On the other hand, the story is rather complicated and may lose people due to all the twists and turns the narrative takes. There is also the destruction mode, which wasn't quite as good as the remembrance mode of the game. I wound up getting into it, but I imagine that not everyone will. Given this, I'm left with a bit of a conundrum. I love the story, characters, and presentation of the game, but I also acknowledge that the game does have some elements that I did notice felt a bit off and that others may not like even more. So it all winds up with the question, where does this leave me in rating 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim? I wrestled with this a lot, but going by my enjoyment of the game, I have to give 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim a 10 out of 10. I fully recognize that this isn't going to be the same for everyone. The complicated story, the weird mashup of genres, and the repetitive nature of destruction mode, and even sometimes remembrance will probably turn some people off, but it didn't for me. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim was an experience unlike any I have really had before. It had a complex and intricate story that managed to stick the landing. It has a weird combination of themes and genres that I wound up enjoying quite a bit. To me, this is a wonderfully weird and compelling gaming experience, but that weirdness may keep some from enjoying it quite as much as I have.
Yeah, they look like octopuses and want to destroy us all, right? No, you've got it all wrong. That's from a book. You're thinking of the War of the Worlds.